Well, good morning to everyone who has joined us this morning. Thank you very much for taking this time to learn more about navigating and applying for COVID-19 business support. The town of Collingwood initiated this in partnership with Strategy Corp, a consultancy specialized in providing counsel to leadership organizations. The team is focused on supporting business through these challenging times and developing a recovery plan as well. That's why many members of town council are actually participating in this webinar. We have set up Zoom to ensure a successful and secure webinar. As a result, we will be taking questions that have been sent to us via email prior, but we will not be taking questions live during the webinar. But the good news is any follow-up questions you have, please feel free to email them to us. We are going to be setting up a follow-up email with a cheat sheet as well as other additional contact information for your reference. With that, I'd like to pass the mic on to Roberta to kick off our webinar this morning.
That's great. Thanks, Martin. Just very quickly, my name is Roberta Kramchinsky. I'm a manager at Strategy Corp. I'm joined here with my team today, Chris Loretto, who's a partner at Strategy Corp, and Carly Lewis, who's our Ontario expert. So I'm just going to turn things over to Chris just to get things started with a little bit of a scene setter, and I'll also turn on our presentation deck so that everybody can see that again. All right, Chris, we'll turn it over to you. You may need to be unmuted before you get started. So just 1 second, and I'm pulling up the deck right now. I see that Chris is still muted, so we'll need to unmute him so that he can say a few words to get us started. Go ahead, Chris.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Roberta, and thank you, Martin, for the introduction. And we're very proud to be partnering with the town to provide its business leaders with this update on what the federal and provincial governments have put in place to support small and medium-sized businesses during this very difficult pandemic period. And as I think everybody knows, and as everybody's been following the news, governments are very seized with not only dealing with the pandemic and the impacts it's having on our friends and family and neighbors and our healthcare system, but also on the economic fallout from that. So a number of measures have been put in place by both levels of government to help address some of the economic issues that have arisen out of the pandemic, putting in place supports for businesses, which Roberta and Carly will take you through, but also putting in place supports for individuals, which we will also be covering because we think they're very much important to be able to, it's very much important that you be able to understand what those programs are in place and perhaps pass that information on to your employees or your friends and family as well, so they understand what resources are there to help them get through this very challenging time. There's nothing I can say that hasn't already been said in terms of the magnitude of the economic challenge that we're facing as a country, and we are certainly in unprecedented times, and things continue to evolve on a minute-by-minute, hour-by-hour, day-by-day basis. And so while we're presenting things here today, this information will continue to evolve, and we would encourage you to keep abreast of those by staying in touch with the town. And also we'll be providing you with a takeaway sheet with some of the key resources and links to the websites of those key resources to keep up to date on any changes that may be made to programs. Because as the governments roll these out, they begin to understand some of the gaps that may exist in those programs and are looking for solutions to solve some of those gaps. So they'll be updating some of the program information as well. So with that, what I'll do is I'll turn it over to Roberta and then Carly. Roberta will take you through the federal supports for businesses and for individuals and answer the questions that we received in advance of this webcast, followed by Carly, who will speak about the provincial measures in place. And we'll talk a little bit about next steps from there. Roberta?
That's great. Thanks, Chris. So in terms of the federal supports, I'll run through kind of the broad range of this as well from the questions that we received in advance we saw that a number of them really focused on a number of the federal measures. So what I'll do is I'm going to present first and foremost, just running through what the federal supports are, and then I'll do a Q&A responding to some of those questions around, particularly related to federal supports. So I think you'll probably be hearing my voice for a little while, for the next little bit, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can for this point. But as Chris said, this is still evolving very quickly and continuing to be refined and be adapted. So we're presenting what we have as the best information today, and things will hopefully stay somewhat static, but at the same time, they will be subject to change, particularly as we get into more of the rollout of these activities. So really, from a federal perspective, the government has had they've really started to focus in on what are going to become essentially the key components of the economic response plan. It's really evolved into this 3-point plan of direct supports to help the economy prepare to rebound. And that's an important part about this. This is really meant to be that emergency valve to address the economic impact of COVID-19 and prepare best for a rebound. It's looking at what are basically temporary measures, trying to figure out how to do this short-term bridge in order to allow the economy to then rebound, regain steam, and return back up to where, hopefully where it was before this crash happened. And on that plan, it's really evolved into 3 points of direct support. One is protecting jobs and being able to protect jobs that currently exist where possible. Where people lose their jobs or lose income, that really falls into the income support component, which is directed towards individuals. And then finally, it's about access to credit for businesses. So those 3 pillars really start to form that basis of the government's approach. And I'll emphasize that these are very, very broad measures. The emphasis has been on how can we get money out the door to as many people as possible as quickly as we can. In that measure, there are going to be people who fall into gaps that they haven't quite figured out how to address yet. But this is really meant to be broad-based, access as many people as quickly as possible. So these measures are not necessarily the most precise. There's general broad guidelines available right now. And sometimes we won't know the finer details of how they'll fit into very specific circumstances at this point. So what we're dealing with now is it's a bit of an uncertain world, and I completely sympathize with businesses who are trying to figure out what do I do in this scenario, and I'll try to answer that as best as I can now. But I just want to preface that there are very broad measures. They may not always fit everything perfectly, but really the objective is to try to get as many of these in place as quickly as possible so that we're able to recover as quickly as we can. And sort of this timeline, just on the arrow, I'm sort of laying out here what's available immediately and then measures we know that are going to be coming in the next 2 to 3 weeks, particularly as the COVID-19 response started to roll out in March. There were some measures that were made available pretty much either immediately or there was really no application process or anything like that. They're either deferrals that just came into effect and then will happen as they happen right now. There are other measures like the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, which will open on Monday, April 6th, as well as the small business wage subsidies. So particularly what is now formally known as the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy is going to be coming into play and into application in mid to late April. So we'll go through those programs in a bit more detail. But this is sort of what's available now. And you'll see on the far right side, I've left some room for future government supports. And that's because this response is still evolving. There will still be additional government supports that will be made available. And the government's trying to be nimble and really be able to respond to what's needed in the economy as they determine what that need is and how they can address it. So this will continue to evolve. There may be additional supports. There may be supports for very specific sectors of the economy which have been hit particularly hard by COVID-19 and the resulting closures and other activities like that. So that's things like perhaps like the airline industry, hospitality, tourism. All of these sectors have really been hit hard, and there are still ongoing efforts to determine how best to support them. So there's sort of a range of things that are available to businesses right away, things that will be available to individuals as soon as possible. So we'll sort of walk through that, but this is a bit of just sort of seeing, you know, what is that broad measure of, broad availability of measures. So let's go through a couple of the ones that really impact businesses or individuals directly. And I've kind of left aside some of the bigger elements that underpin this, things like the Bank of Canada lowering its overnight rate last Friday, actions that have been taken by the Bank of Canada to ensure that there's liquidity in the financial system. Those are all really important measures that ensure that there's an ability to respond to the economic crisis. But really what I've chosen to focus in on here are those measures that will be the most directly applicable to businesses, and that essentially kind of come into the equation of what puts cash into accounts as quickly as we can. So I'll go through those. Really some of these key measures, the big one, and I know we've got a number of questions around this one, is the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. So this is a measure which would provide 75% of salary or wages on the first $58,700 earned by an employee. So it goes up to about $847 per week. So essentially this is it's a measure meant to try to keep as many employees on payroll as possible during this period, recognizing that there may not be work, but there may not be sort of employment during that period, but it keeps people on payroll as opposed to putting them on to, laying them off, having them go on to EI or apply for the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. So this is really meant to be a temporary measure to help ensure that people remain on payroll. And it's available for essentially what's a 3-month period. It's really broken down by week. It's backdated to March 15th and is scheduled to be in place till June 6th, 2020 right now. So really to qualify for this, it's really available to employers who have suffered a drop in revenues of at least 30% in either March, April, or May when compared to the previous month last year. So that's really the measure that they're using to determine, are you eligible for this? It is available to all sorts of employers, so it doesn't matter if you're a small business or a large business. It's available to all employers and available across all sectors. That includes not-for-profits and charities as well. So this is a very broad-based measure, and really trying to access that point. So it really does provide 75% of that salary. The expectation is that employers will make the best efforts to top up the salaries to 100% of what would be covered, recognizing that may not always be possible, but it's a stated sort of indication that this would be very important for businesses to do if they can during this period. So in terms of the application, this is going to be opening up in the next 3 to 6 weeks. There's a bit of variability around when that timing is. Hopefully, I think there's going to be as many efforts placed as possible to open it up as soon as possible, but we're probably looking at about 3 weeks' time is likely that window. The application portal will be hosted by the Canada Revenue Agency, and businesses will receive the subsidy from Canada Revenue Agency. So given that time frame, what can be done to help ensure that there's essentially the fastest access to the subsidy is for businesses to ensure that they've set up electronic communications with CRA through a My account, as well as ensuring that direct deposit is set up with CRA. That just, those are just items that will help to ensure that the communication with CRA is sped up as quickly as it can be, and that funds can be received as quickly as possible. If you're receiving something by check, it will just take longer for the check to be issued and to be received as opposed to direct deposit. So those are essentially the application. We don't have a ton of detail right now. And again, as this continues to evolve, we will find out more about that. But really that's what we're looking at in terms of an application. It will be by the business to CRA and online as much as possible. We'll speed that up. I'll review a couple of other measures. I know we've got a few questions that talk more about this wage subsidy, so I'll go through those shortly, but this is just to provide that introduction to the subsidy. Sort of in addition, there's a couple other measures that are available to employers, and particularly if there are situations where you may see a decline in the work available. They've also extended and expanded the work sharing program through employment insurance. So basically it takes the existing work sharing program and has expanded its availability to 76 weeks as opposed to 38 weeks. They've also just eased some of the eligibility requirements and streamlined the application process to make that a bit easier. So this is another option available just to manage your human resources and see if there's a way to split work and to share that amongst employees, keeps them on payroll while still receiving some top up from employment insurance. And that can also be another option to address some of these downturn times. So just in terms of eligibility, there are more strict and developed parameters around that. You need to be a year-round business in Canada for at least a year, a private business, publicly held company, or a not-for-profit, and have at least 2 employees in what they call the work-sharing unit, so at least 2 to share. And similarly, there's eligibility around employees. They must be year-round, permanent, full-time or part-time employees. They must be eligible to receive EI and agree to share essentially agree to participate in the work term, share their work and share the available work hours. So with the application, that application goes through Service Canada, and the hope is to apply that about 10 calendar days prior to the start of the work sharing agreement. There's 2 forms that are specific to that program. We also have a link to this program on our leave behind, not so much leave behind, but here, our takeaway sheet for today. So that is also another option available to ensure that we keep as many people on payroll as possible while accessing EI. Flipping more to the credit available to businesses, one measure that has been introduced by the government is this Canada Emergency Business Account. And particularly what this offers is an interest-free loan of up to $40,000 to small businesses and not-for-profits. It's intended to help cover operating costs during a period where revenues have been reduced. In particular, sort of the eligibility, it is focused on small businesses. So it's looking at essentially a qualifying organization would need a demonstrated payroll between $50,000 and $1 million in 2019. So this is a way to ensure that there's some credit available to help businesses bridge the gap in terms of these times when revenues have been reduced. The loans are interest-free. There's also a forgivable amount up to 25% if that loan is paid back by December 31st, 2022, I believe. So that also has a bit of a little indication of sort of the intent of this loan is to make it as easy as possible for businesses to access. In terms of the application, and with a lot of the credit programs that the federal government has introduced, they have made funds available that will flow through financial institutions. So if you're interested in this type of account, businesses should work with their financial institution. And I understand that there is a huge demand on financial institutions these days to help their clients access these types of funds. And I've read and understanding that there's been a bit of a rollout on these things. There's been a number of credit programs made available. And there's been a rollout that's being designed to ensure that people can access these for their businesses. The Canada Emergency Business Account is expected to be accessible within a week or so through your financial institution. So that should be available very shortly. As well, sort of the broader business credit programs, there's 2 measures that have been introduced largely supported through Export Development Canada, as well as the Business Development Bank of Canada, to work with private sector lenders to provide added credit for businesses, including in different sectors, including oil and gas, air transportation, and tourism. And really, there's two separate programs. The first is a loan guarantee program for small and medium-sized enterprises, where Export Development Canada is working with financial institutions to open new operating credit and cash flow term loans. These can go up to $6.25 million. And similarly, they're working with BDC to establish a co-lending program for small and medium-sized enterprises. Again, these loans can go up to $6.25 million. The majority of that is backed by BDC. So both of these programs, they're also rolling out in the next couple of weeks, next 2 to 3 weeks. And again, the access point for these is with financial institutions. So your current financial institution is the entry point for that. It's just a matter of, again, I understand that there are a lot of ongoing issues in terms of being able to access your bank and get in touch with people. And that is sort of the situation we find ourselves in, is that there are a lot of people trying to access the same resources at the same time. But again, that is the method with which we're going to be able to access this. So there are these credit programs that are available to provide loans in this time. Looking more to what would have an immediate impact on cash flow for businesses, the federal government has also introduced 2 major tax deferrals. The first is deferring income taxes until September, essentially. So this is available to all businesses to defer the payment of any income tax amounts that are owing on or after March 18th and before September 2020. So that immediately defers that income tax payment until September. In this, as well, to support that, the Canada Revenue Agency is also essentially saying that that no interest or penalties will accumulate on those amounts during that period. So if you have something that is owed, it's not going to incur a penalty during that period while you defer it. As well, they're also essentially not initiating any assessments or audits for the next 4 weeks. This is a bit of both ensuring that there are resources available to CRA to support setting up the new programs, and as well to ensure that businesses have access to those funds that they may have in their accounts to bridge this period. So there's the income tax deferral, and as well, we've also seen a deferral of GST, HST payments, as well as customs duty payments until June 30th. So that's, again, it's aimed to free up cash flow in the short term. These, for both the GST, HST payments, as well as customs duty payments, those are deferred until June 30th. Depending on how you file your remittances, whether it's monthly, quarterly, or annually, you'll see on the screen, it tells you which periods which periods those amounts are deferred for. And if it's for customs duty payments for imported goods, deferrals include the amounts owing for March, April, and May of this year. So those are rather large components, and they also do free up a significant amount of, on the aggregate, significant amount of money. I think these measures total, the deferred taxation measures amount to about $85 billion or something like that in the economy. So just trying to ensure that there is still some money flowing in the economy. And then to complement that, and I think this is another significant measure, is that the government's approach has been to identify how they can get money into the hands of Canadians as quickly as possible, and recognizing the impact of the COVID-19 response on the economy writ large, as well as on individual workers, as well as people who, because of COVID-19 are now finding themselves without income because they have to stay home, and whether they're taking care of dependent children or other dependents, just trying to find ways to address that need immediately. And that's where the Canada Emergency Response Benefit comes into play. And I think we've probably heard a lot about this in the last little while. It is a taxable benefit of $2,000 a month for up to 4 months for people who are impacted by COVID-19. And it is critical to note that this is really meant to be an income replacement program, and it is the eligibility. It has a lot of details in here, and I'm going to go through them because I do think it's really important to understand how the emergency response benefit works. It is particularly related to COVID-19, and that is critical for it. If you so workers, whether they're self-employed or employed and have ceased working for 14 consecutive days due to COVID-19, are eligible to apply for the benefit. your EI eligibility doesn't matter. You can be EI eligible or not, and you're still able to access the benefit. And really, it is focused on workers who have stopped working due to COVID-19 and don't have access to paid leave or other income support, workers who are sick or quarantined or taking care of someone who is sick with COVID-19, working parents who must stay home to pay for, without the ability to pay for care for children that are sick or need to take additional care because of school and daycare closures, workers who have had, you can still also, pardon me, you can also still be employed but not being paid because there's no work due to COVID-19. That's an important one as well too. There's still an ability to stay attached to your employer, but still have access to the CERB. And as well, it also applies to wage earners, self-employed workers, contract workers who otherwise wouldn't be eligible for employment insurance. I think it's really important to note that all of these reasons, they're related to not working or not receiving income because of COVID-19. If somebody hasn't stopped working because of COVID-19, they're not eligible for CERB. I think that's a critical point. And finally, there's this additional sort of just for the worker side, there are 3 key components of just eligibility for to access the benefit. A worker must be at least 15 years of age. They must be a resident of Canada, and they have to have an income of at least $5,000 in 2019 or the 12 months prior to the date of their application. So there's just a little bit of an eligibility requirement there to ensure that this around the benefit. So I will go through this. There are a couple of questions that relate back to this. You cannot, essentially the benefit is meant to be a standalone benefit. It cannot be used in combination with employment insurance, and it cannot be used in combination with the wage subsidy. Those I think are 2 really important things. It's meant to be just on the one benefit on its own. So in terms of applying for that, individuals will be able to start applying for that next week through the Canada Revenue Agency. In order to speed up payments and processing, people are urged to ensure that they have a My Account for individuals through Canada Revenue Agency, and setting up direct deposit, which will speed up the ability to receive that credit. And just one final note on application: if somebody has applied for employment insurance as of March 15th, that application will be essentially directed towards receiving the CERB. So that will direct people to that immediately. And if once the benefit runs out, if they are still in a point where they could be making an employment insurance claim, if they're eligible, they can then switch over to an EI benefit after that. But for now, this has become essentially the broad base income support available to people who have lost income due to COVID-19. And just one other sort of program that's been added in, where somebody is eligible for employment insurance and is sick due to COVID-19. Government has also opened up access to the EI sickness benefit. So this provides up to 15 weeks of income replacement when somebody is who's unable to work due to illness, injury, or quarantine. So there's no waiting period. The 1-week waiting period has been waived, and no medical certificate is required for an EI sickness benefit due to quarantine. So where there is, where somebody has access to EI sickness benefit, this would be, and they are not working because they are sick due to COVID-19, this is in a way that this is open to them. So that there's a web page on EI sickness benefits that can be applied to directly, and you can do that first. So essentially the application, the action there is to apply online and submit that application immediately. So I'll just go through some of the questions and answers, and I know there's a bunch of information about this, about these programs altogether and how they interact. I think this will help to sort of look at a few of these. And sort of particularly on the first questions are really focused on the wage subsidy. So we'll take a look at that first. I think in terms of, so the question here is for the 75% wage subsidy, we're looking at how is the 30% decrease in revenues calculated. Essentially, that eligibility is determined by comparing year-over-year revenue. You can see on the screen, it's basically a 3-month program. There are 3 eligibility periods. You can see what is the reference period for eligibility. For not-for-profits and charities, which again, the revenue comparison may not be the best fit. Government is continuing to determine what would be the most appropriate definition of revenue for those circumstances. So additional details will be coming. And if you have a new business, say something that's been established after February 2019, so the year-over-year revenue comparison isn't great, eligibility is going to be determined by comparing monthly revenues to a more reasonable benchmark, something within the last 12 months. So again, there's sort of broad measures in place. There are still some circumstances where things have not been quite as refined yet, so details will continue to be evolving for those. Particularly, this question is really interesting. I think it would apply to a lot of smaller businesses as well. But with relation to a retail business or a small business that's incorporated, where the business owner is also the sole shareholder, would the shareholder not be able to qualify? Or normally, the shareholder wouldn't be able to apply for EI. Does the 75% wage subsidy apply there? The really broad eligibility looks at individuals, taxable corporations, partnerships consisting of eligible employers, not-for-profits, and registered charities. There is some added detail that a special rule will apply to employees that don't deal at an arm's length with the employer. And in that case, there is a subsidy amount available for those employees. It's limited to the eligible remuneration paid in any pay period between March 15th and June 6th. And again, up to that maximum benefit of $847 per week, or 75% of the pre-crisis weekly remuneration. So again, the wage subsidy really applies, refers back to what is the employee's remuneration in that scenario. Again, should I rehire employees even if I'm not going to make them work, i.e. stores are closed? And if so, how many hours should I hire them back for? And here's what the best I can sort of provide for this answer right now is that the emergency wage subsidy is really aimed to reduce job losses, and it is meant to encourage workers to rehire workers that have been previously laid off. So we know that the subsidy will be available for 12 weeks. It's retroactive to March 15th. And where possible, employers are expected to maintain pre-crisis employment earnings. So there's what the guidance available right now is that there's nothing specific saying how long should I hire employees back for, what that should be. But I think just consider that this is the period that's available for the subsidy. And if you have that employee on payroll, then you have access to that subsidy. If your business doesn't qualify for the 75% wage subsidy, and that's a great question because it does have some requirements around it. And if let's say you have losses that are not as significant as 30%, for example, there is still availability. So the initial wage subsidy that was announced was a 10% temporary wage subsidy, and that program does still exist. So if you don't meet the criteria for the 75% subsidy, there is still some access to a wage subsidy to support that. So that's equal to 10% of remuneration from March 18th to June 19th. It is set at a maximum of $1,375 for eligible employees and to a maximum of $25,000 per employer. So essentially this subsidy is essentially you just reduce the amount of the subsidy from your remittances to income tax that you would send to CRA. So there's additional information on that available online. With respect to the CERB, so what are the qualifications to be eligible for it? And again, the broad answer to that is that it's a temporary income support for workers who have stopped work and are not receiving income as a result of CERB. There are going to be situations where somebody may have only a reduction in income, and that's a bit of a gap in the system right now. But essentially you have to have complete loss of income or stopped work as a result of COVID-19 to access that. And again, it's for workers who have stopped working as a result of COVID-19. For as a small business owner who still has some income coming in, but no revenue from business, would they still qualify? Again, it's available to those who stop working related to COVID-19 or are eligible for EI, regular or sickness benefits. I think in this particular case, the employer should apply for the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy and be able to use that to back up and backfill that revenue. So you do still have some revenue. You have not stopped working as a result. So that, I think, directs it towards the subsidy side as opposed to the emergency response benefit. And this is a great question. Does an employee need to be laid off to access CERB? And the answer to that is no. Workers can remain attached to their company and receive the benefit. It's because to access it, you have to be without income for at least 14 days during that initial period. And then subsequently, you have to expect to have no employment income in order to receive it. So you can still remain attached to the company, but if you're not receiving income and not working as a result, that's how you can still access the CRB through that. And then finally, can someone receive both employment insurance and the emergency response benefit? And the answer to that is no. They cannot be received for the same period. If you're already receiving EI benefits prior to March 15th, it's really March 15th is sort of that start date for these emergency programs. If you're receiving EI before that date, those benefits will continue through that benefit period. So if that benefit period expires and then that person is still without work due to COVID-19, then they may be eligible for CERB and can apply at that time. You also cannot receive the emergency wage subsidy for an employee during the period if that employee is eligible and receiving the response benefit. So again, these are meant to be sort of standalone programs. They don't overlap on top of each other. And do I need to issue a record of employment to employees for closures due to COVID-19? And sort of the brief answer as best we have now is that if employees are directly affected and they are no longer working, employers should issue a record of employment. There are some guidance here on the slide from the federal government that talks about what are the proper codes to use for that in terms of whether a sick employee is sick, when an employee is not working due to a shortage of work because of coronavirus, as well as when an employee refuses to come to work but is not sick or quarantined. There's some guidance available there, and that I think that's the best guidance that we have on that question at this time. So I think that kind of concludes a large part of the federal component of that. I hope that it helps to provide some clarity on what programs are available to employers, as well as answering some of those questions around it. Again, I'll just reiterate this is a situation which continues to evolve. And as we get closer to applications being open for things like the CERB for individuals, as well as the emergency wage subsidy for employers, there will be added details about applications and what's required for those. So we're trying to hopefully provide you with resources that will direct you to the best, most recent information for those. So thanks for submitting those questions in advance, and I hope that has been helpful. At this point, I'll turn it over to my colleague Carly Lewis, who will walk through Ontario's action plan and talk about some of those talk about what's available to employers and businesses in Ontario. Carly.
Hi, Roberta. Thanks so much. And I think hopefully the Ontario measures to date are a bit more straightforward than the federal measures, so hopefully we can get through them a bit quicker. So moving to the next slide, on March 25th, the provincial government announced a $17 billion action plan in response to COVID-19. There were kind of two overwhelming goals related to the measures that were introduced. The first was, and predominantly, was to increase capacity in the province's healthcare system. So that included a number of investments to hospitals, long-term care, protective equipment, and a contingency fund for healthcare moving forward. The second goal was to provide immediate supports to workers, families, and businesses. So that would include $3.7 billion to people in jobs. So that can range from anything, from additional costs associated with school and daycare closures, doubling the guaranteed annual income for seniors, OSAP loan deferrals for students, and then I believe it was roughly 150 million flowing through municipalities to support charities and not-for-profits. Today, we're focusing on tax and other deferrals for a total of 10 billion. 6 billion of that is deferred taxes. So we can get started on that. Next slide, please. In terms of the timeline, as mentioned, the goal was really to provide immediate relief. Most of the measures came into effect immediately when legislation was passed on March 25th. The additional measures, most of them have come into effect as of April 1st. Once again, the government was really focused on leveraging existing mechanisms as opposed to developing new programs that could take weeks to roll out and get right. That's been their focus to date. With that said, the government has continued to stress that these measures are a first and immediate step, and there will be more to come. So moving on to business tax relief. So the government's committed to providing 5 months of interest and penalty-free relief for businesses to file and make payments for the majority of provincially administered taxes. So there's 10 in total that are listed on the slide. This is anticipated to free up approximately 6 billion in cash flow for close to, I believe it's 100,000 businesses. The goal is really to provide flexibility to businesses who are struggling to meet these tax obligations. They're obviously, at this time, they will be expected to pay them at some point in the future. And in terms of timeline, this went into effect on April 1st and will go until August 31st, 2020. Government has committed to kind of reassessing this end date closer to August, depending on the situation related to COVID-19. So in terms of eligibility, any business that pays any of these 10 taxes and is unable to file and make payments, they are eligible. You do not need to apply or notify the government of your inability to file or pay. It just happens automatically, and that penalties and interest will be waived right away. Moving on to the employer health tax. So the government's proposing to double the EHT exemption in 2020. So the increase will be from the current exemption, which is 490,000 to 1 million for 2020. This equates roughly to a tax cut of, I believe, 35 million. This is retroactive. The exemption is scheduled to return to the original threshold in January 2021. So again, to be determined whether that will be reassessed, but this time, as of the new year, it will go back to the original exemption. In terms of eligibility, payrolls of up to 5 million are exempt on their first 1 million of remuneration in Ontario. So the government anticipates that this will positively impact around 57,000 employers who will pay less EHT. Similar to the previous eligibility rules, employers with the total Ontario remuneration of 5 million are not eligible for increased exemption. In terms of applying, the return form does not change, only the amount for exemption does. If you've already filed your taxes, the ministry will review and correct this retroactively. If you don't owe money due to the exemption, you do not have to file. And if you miss filing, as mentioned on the previous slide, due to the new tax deferral measures, you are not penalized. Moving to temporary deferral of WSIB payments. So this allows Schedule 1 and 2 businesses to defer premium reporting and payments until August 31st. No interest will accrue on outstanding premium payments. And this applies to all businesses who pay monthly, quarterly, or annually based on insurable earnings. You'll be eligible for deferral. So for instance, if you pay monthly, you can defer your payment for the March 31st period. In terms of application, all businesses are supported by WSIB's workplace insurance are automatically eligible for financial package. WSIB will continue to assess the impact and next steps in terms of paying deferred payments and the impact on premium rates kind of as this goes. They'll continue to evaluate and work with the sector to ensure that this will be a manageable situation moving forward. Any questions related to this, although this was a government announcement, it should be dealt through WSIB. Moving now to electricity relief. So the government announced actually just before their March 25th announcement that they're setting electricity prices for residential, farm, as small business time of use customers at the lowest rate. So this is known as off-peak pricing for 24 hours a day for 45 days effective March 24th. Obviously, this is more tailored towards residents who are now at home all day and using their electricity. With that said, anyone that's using on-peak pricing, so small businesses defined as those using under peak demand of 50 kilowatts will be eligible. The estimated cost relief for this time frame, the 45 days, will be $162 million. And the new pricing will be automatically applied to upcoming hydro bills. Similar to the other measures the government has announced, they'll reassess the 45 days once they get closer to the end date. It would be a fairly significant cost to the government if this goes into the summer, but it may just have to happen. Moving to municipal property taxes. So the government's postponing reassessment for 2021, which was expected to happen this year. This will provide a level of certainty to municipalities, residents, and businesses on what property tax reassessments will look like next year. In addition, the province is deferring the upcoming June 30th quarterly municipal remittance of education property tax to school boards for 90 days. So this does allow the rationale behind this was that it would provide municipalities the flexibility to provide property tax deferrals to residents and businesses. I know the town of Collingwood, the city council has approved a number of measures, including waiving tax penalty and interest charges, which is fantastic, and they're continuing to explore additional relief options. So in terms of what next, see, much more straightforward than the federal measures. A lot of it's obviously automatically applied, but in terms of what's next, obviously there are gaps in the government's current measures. It doesn't address self-employed. It obviously there's an end date for many of these measures. The government has been very, very crystal clear that these are immediate and first steps. The government later today, the health officials of the province are releasing modeling on what the outbreak's going to do to the province long term. So we might have a better sense of how long that will last then. But the government has said it's open to considering stimulus measures. There's going to be additional supports for businesses and workers. They're continuing to look at everything. All options are on the table. The one thing I apologize, I missed at the start, but if any businesses do have ideas related to Ontario Together, the government set up a dedicated website where any business can submit ideas. The greatest need right now, and I'm sure you've heard it all over the news, you're hearing it from your local hospital, is the provision of medical products. So a lot of personal protective equipment. If there's any ability for businesses to repurpose and redeploy capacity to support this, government is really looking for support here, but there's also a number of other measures that the government's looking for support on. And in support of this, government recognizes businesses can't necessarily do this alone. So they've launched the Ontario Together Fund, which consists of $50 million for submissions. So all this can be done through the Ontario Together website. They're open to ideas. They continue to stress that they are looking to hear from the business community on what's needed in terms of next steps. And I should just add that most of the measures that were announced on March 25th had to be done via legislation. If there's any regulatory red tape measures that can be done to support businesses, that's something the government's actively looking to support as well. And that's it from me, Roberta.
Great. Well, thanks, Carly. And I think that, that wraps up essentially our formal presentation component. I don't know, Chris, if you have any sort of final closing thoughts, maybe if you have a quick minute or two, and then we can turn it over to Martin to wrap up.
No, I mean, I can fully appreciate we've thrown a lot of information at you, and there's, as we said, some of the criteria for these programs that have been put in place continue to evolve, and gaps need to continue to be filled. So I would encourage you to stay in touch with the town, stay in touch with Martin to get the latest updates. The leave behind that will be circulated via email afterwards will have the key links to all these programs. We would encourage you to look at those in some detail. a number of you who may have accountants or other professionals supporting you, you can always refer to them as well to get additional details on your eligibility and how you'd go about applying and being able to satisfy application requirements. My own accountant sent me some specific details on the wage subsidy and the loan program earlier this morning. And I would just like to say Strategy Corp is here to help if anybody does need help. We are we've recently become a medium-sized business officially based on headcount, and all our folks are working really hard. And our commitment is to try to make sure that we ride out the storm and that we're able to support our people through it. As I know, it is a priority for all of you as well. So we're all in this together. And if there's anything we can do to help out, please let us know. But otherwise, it's been a real privilege to be able to put this presentation onto you. And want to wish you all the best through getting through this period, and hope that you and your families and your staff are able to stay safe and healthy during this very trying time. Martin?
Thank you, Roberta, Carly, and Chris. Hopefully everyone found this helpful and, importantly, action-focused. Details and links, references mentioned today during this email are going to get sent out to you this morning via email, so watch for that. It's also going to include some more information on links to past and future webinars that we're planning out of the Business Development Center in Collingwood. That email is also going to include links to some of the advisors that we've got waiting virtually, of course, at the Business Development Center to help you with any local questions that you may have. You can also sign up for our weekly economic recovery email at the link that I'm going to send you, which is www.collingwood.ca/recovery. And that's, of course, going to provide any extra updates that become available as the weeks go on, if you will. On behalf of Town Council, staff, and Strategy Corp, thank you. Stay home, stay healthy.